Okay, so this week we are talking about the social construction of identity. And of course, this follows with the topic of previous weeks, talking about reality as socially constructed. But today we're going to talk specifically about what it means to think of identity in this way. And the first presentation will be on the axes of identity, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. So it's good to think about how this fits in with the rest of the things we've been talking about, because in some ways, being able to think about identity is something that people who have more privilege are able to do and really spend more time focusing on and concentrating on. We talked about the social aspects of life and how things, people and resources and so on are distributed, and of course that depending on how those things are distributed can really affect how much time you really spend kind of focusing on what identity is all about. So when we do have this opportunity to think about it, it does bring up a lot of questions. For example, what is identity actually used for? And how, what kind of terms do we use to actually think about identity? In our chapter of the textbook, chapter 6, Robin speaks a bit about, or writes a bit about, these two terms, egocentric and sociocentric cultures. And he uses these concepts with reference to Americans as a Western culture, and then he uses the example of the Japanese as a sociocentric culture. And the idea here is that these terms can be used to kind of categorize different cultural groups, and we'll be able to really answer some of these questions that identity brings up. However, when we look at how Robbins actually talks about this in the textbook, and he's not the only one, other anthropologists as well have taken this route, we see that these terms really limit the way we can talk about identity. So in some ways, it's a little bit careless to include such a short section that tries to identify two cultural groups using these two broad terms. If we look at any culture, we would find aspects that are egocentric and aspects that are sociocentric. And of course, we can see that if we look at Americans as well. We can see even the schooling method, it has tended towards more and more group work and so on. And so there's aspects of a sociocentric sensibility built into many of our social systems as well. So it doesn't quite work to try to distinguish and categorize cultures. It's too general. It brings up too many issues because it tries to categorize a large group that's diverse in one of these two main ways of describing identities and the way people think of themselves. One of the issues here is that he's not really presenting how we might use something like this to talk about a culture, but we'd be talking about it simply in terms of an ideal type. So Max Weber, it's pronounced Weber because it's a German name, he is a German sociologist and political economist, and he's very, very influential in the United States, in anthropology, because he presented a lot of different ideas about politics and economics that have been an ongoing influence in the field. He was the author of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which he wrote in the early 1900s. And in that, he argues about how cultural ideals from Protestantism really contributed to the rise of capitalism. In order to really make this argument, though, he has to draw on an ideal type. So an ideal type is an artificial picture of a social phenomenon constructed by a researcher to highlight features of a pattern. So it's a simplification of something in order to try to look at features of a pattern. So at a certain point, when we try to talk about any kind of complex social phenomenon, we can get caught up in describing the complexity to such a degree that we can't really do anything once we've tried to describe the complexity, right? So in order to move forward, sometimes there is a simplifying aspect that goes on, and as long as we recognize that that's what we're doing, that can be a useful tool for us. So the problems with what's happening in our chapter when Robbins talks about sociocentric and egocentric is that he's not really recognizing this as a look at ideal types, and instead is more focused on saying that, or presenting it as if this is an actual descriptor of these two different cultural groups. Anytime we have an ideal type, we have to recognize reality is going to be more complex. So another example that I always think of is when we talked about kinship last week, and we're talking about families, and we have this picture in our mind of the ideal family in whatever cultural group that we are from, yet very few of us actually have a family like that, right? So we know what the ideal type is, the kind of artificial picture, but it's not necessarily matching with reality, because reality is more complex. Okay. So a better way to be thinking about identity, or at least a way that a lot of people have been thinking about it that is has more flexibility to it and can account for more complexity, is to talk about the axes of identity. And so there's these different kinds of terms that we use to talk about identity, and we can lump this idea together as the axes of identities, the various characteristics which we would use to place people on the social landscape. Robbins in our chapter talks about this as an identity toolkit, and as he describes, there are fairly universal characteristics that we find every culture creating categories around, and these are family membership, gender, and age. But other examples of these kinds of characteristics that we use might not be found cross-culturally. So some of those include ethnic group membership, sexual identity, skin color, wealth, religious affiliation, and so on. I'm sure you can think of others as well. So when we look at these characteristics and think about this definition, we have to kind of back up a little bit. What does it mean to be placing people on a social landscape? What are we talking about when we say that? And in one way, we're saying that when we have these different categories in our mind, this is what we use to kind of size someone up. It allows us to gather more complexity fairly quickly, but it always leads us to differentiate. In other words, whenever we make a distinction about a characteristic, who's in what category of that characteristic, we're including some people and excluding other people. When we talked about cultural politics a few weeks back, we can see how that often actually draws on these axes of identity in different claims that are made. So one example being language. That's an example that goes in the other example category here, or national identity as well, right? So to help us kind of understand a little bit more about how identity works socially, we have to think a bit about Simone de Beauvoir's work. So hopefully some of you have heard of her. She just lost my place in my notes. She was a French philosopher, and she wrote this very, very famous book called The Second Sex. She published that in 1949. And this book was actually understood to have initiated, or one of the kind of early inspirational texts for second wave of feminism. In any case, she made the argument, actually I believe I have that on my next slide. Yeah, she argued that men define women in order to complete their definitions of themselves. So in other words, she's making this claim here that identity is only possible when a distinction is made between two different groups. So an identity of male is only possible if there's another category called female that male identity can be defined in relation to. So in other words, these identity distinctions we make are actually relational distinctions. They can't begin from a blank slate. It would be meaningless unless it's defined relative to something else. And so that means that it involves, what's available, the kinds of categories that are built within our culture, and making contrasts between distinctions in those categories. So it sets up an us and them understanding within the culture as well. And all of this means that defining others is a really essential part of creating an identity. So when we think about all those axes of identity that I just previously discussed, they all work in this similar way, where every time we have a category of identity, and the way we associate ourselves within that category is always in relation to a group that we do not consider ourselves part of, in order to make a claim regarding our identity. And we can really look at this when we start to talk about gender. So I'm going to use gender as a kind of example. It's a universal, every culture has ways of distinguishing people via gender categories. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail as a way of illustrating this notion of identity not being able to come from a blank slate. So the first thing is we have to really think about what it means to call gender a cultural construction. So you may have heard this before, but in case you haven't, I want to make sure that you understand what this means. So a lot of us might think that, people are born with certain biology and that determines what your gender is, and that's it. But if you remember, of course, when we think of culture and anthropology, we're talking about systems of meaning that inform the way that we understand the world and the way we act in the world. And we see gender operating in that same way. So it means to say that there is a material reality. In other words, it's not all just in our heads. We have bodies with certain characteristics, but then the meaning that we attribute to that is actually socially constructed. So identities come from this meaning that we associate with the characteristics and the way we kind of divide up those characteristics, instead of actually being given by any kind of set of universal biology. So when people talk about this, talk about gender and talk about social construction of gender, people often talk about a distinction between sex versus gender, and they talk about sex as being biological and gender as being social. But I find this actually fairly limited, because it still neglects the idea that we actually construct two biological categories. If you want to look strictly biologically, there are approximately 4% of people who do not fit in the two mainstream biological categories. I think we have to recognize that even our biological categories, science is not completely immune to the social construction of our reality within our culture. And this is one of the ways that that's true. We know that even for people who biologically seem to fit fully in one of these categories or the other, people don't necessarily identify in that same way. So people don't always identify with the gender they were assigned at birth based on their biology, no matter what that biology is, right? So let's see. So this creation of these kind of two biological sex categories leaves out a lot of this variation. There are so many different factors to consider: genitalia, internal organs, hormones, and so on. Of course, when someone is intersex, so maybe someone who's in the 4% of people born with biological categories that are biological characteristics that fit in both of our conventional gender categories, traditionally they were assigned to a category and then surgically altered. That's, I believe, in Western societies happening less and less, but that shows us the power that these kinds of cultural categories can have, where the biology was then tried to be sadly tried to be altered to fit the biological categories that were assumed to exist, usually or often to the detriment of people who then had to live with the kind of surgical procedures that had been done to them without their choice. So, of course, then there are also people, as I mentioned, who don't identify with their assigned gender, no matter what their biology is, and that's an increasingly visible population here in the United States and many places in the world as well. Of course, our transgendered community is what I'm referring to here. And then we have lots of ethnographic examples as well that help us to see how these two conventional categories that we have in Western society, male and female, is not the way that all cultures around the globe think of or have conceived of or conceptualized gender. So the two notable examples that anthropologists like to talk about are many different Native American societies that have a third gender category, and then that's actually discussed in our textbook in Chapter 6. And then another example that's discussed quite a bit are the Hijras in India. So Hijras are a cultural category of people who are neither male nor female. They may be understood as man plus woman or erotic and sacred female men. Many people identifying as Hijras live together. Many of them go through a surgical procedure to remove any genitalia and often dress as female. But they have really important roles within the community, such as blessing children and so on. And this is an aspect of culture in much of northern India that has existed for a very, very, very long time. And we can see how that has actually contributed to a little more, not perfect, but more acceptance of people who don't fit these two very conventional Western categories. I know that in India there's been a push to create an ID system where everybody would have an ID, and the IDs had 3 gender categories built into them: male, female, and transgender. And I know that in India recently transgender people just achieved very important legal status. So anyway, so there's a long history of this, but in many different cultures we see more than these two kind of dominant categories of cultural understanding of gender. If you're interested in reading more about this, there's a wonderful book that I've put the information on, or put the information on the slide here for you. It's edited by Gilbert Hurt, and it's called Third Sex, Third Gender, and it's a collection of a lot of different ethnographic essays about third sex, third gender. So this information about the Hijras is actually, you can read much, much more about that by reading Serena Nanda's chapter, which is chapter 8 in this textbook. Or it's not a textbook, it's an edited volume. Okay. So once we start really kind of thinking about all of this, it helps us to open the door to really think about how so many of the assumptions we have about what men do and what women do are culturally based, much more than biologically based. Or certainly we can't say there's any kind of universal biological basis for our assumptions about what men do and what women do. And what everybody else does who does not associate or does not identify themselves in one of those two categories. Okay, so this ends part 1, or presentation 1, and so we will pick up talking about identity from a little bit different perspective in the next presentation.